Say It Loud Network presents Corner Table Talk.
Hello and welcome to Corner Table Talk. Today, my guest is the chairman and CEO of Ark Restaurants. Ark is a publicly traded restaurant company with restaurants in New York City, Florida, Washington, D.C., Las Vegas, and many other places. The CEO, Michael Weinstein, is a 40-year veteran of the industry, and I've known Michael for 20 plus years. Ark Restaurants grosses over $160 million annually. Of course, that was pre-COVID. But Michael is just a trendsetter and a pioneer in our industry, and we are so pleased to have him today. So Michael, I'm gonna hit things off here with what I call our little short order segment. A couple of questions I just want to fire at you, get your little quick response, and then we'll roll into a conversation. There are a bunch of things I want to touch on with you. So, favorite vacation spot?
Oh, I must say that about 15 years ago, I took my first trip to Africa, Kenya and Tanzania. I spent 22 days there, and it was enthralling for me. The vastness of it, the people were great, the cacophony of colors, it was really to see the animals and see the great migration from Kenya into Tanzania. Literally, you see 1 million animals, not using that as an exaggeration. There are 1 million animals, and I was just blown away by the whole thing. And I've gone back 3 times. I've been to Rwanda to see the silverback gorillas. If I had my druthers, Africa is one of the places I would return. I also loved Australia. I have relatives in Australia, but I loved Sydney. So those are the long-haul vacations, I'd say. But I take all my vacations with my children, and it's just a great time for the family to discover new things.
Yeah, man, those are great places you named. Thank you for that. Most memorable meal?
Well, I had a funny experience. I owned Lutèce in New York for a while, and Andre Saltner was a famous French chef who came over here in the 50s. And Lutèce was a 4-star restaurant, and he sold it to me when he wanted to retire, and we kept it going. And my then wife Nancy, who is still my closest friend, and I wanted to go to Paris, and I called Andre up and I said, Andre, could you get me a reservation at Thai Levant, which is like the Lutèce of Paris, or one of them, and I have 2 favorite meals. This was one of them, and the only reservation he could get was for lunch the day we landed. And I fell asleep in the middle of the meal. I was so tired. So that's a memorable meal.
That is memorable.
Yeah. And she kept kicking me and saying, "You can't fall asleep here." And the owner kept on coming over. Is something wrong? And then there's a restaurant in south of France called Bacon, and Nancy and I flew to Nice. This was on another trip, and we had a reservation for dinner at Bacon. We were supposed to land at 3 p.m. The plane did not land until 9 p.m. It was raining. It was really delayed. We called Bacon, and this was before cell phones or anything, and we were fumbling at the airport to try to figure out how to call the restaurant. And we apologized that we couldn't notify them. And we said, can we come over now? And he says, can you get here right away? We close at 10. And by the time we rented a car, we got there at about 10 after 10. And they had closed the restaurant, but they kept the table open for us. And so we had the whole restaurant to ourselves. It was magical.
As Michael and Nancy Weinstein should. I love that. All right, this one's going to be hard for you. The 69 Mets or the 73 Knicks?
73 Knicks.
Just because you own Clyde's restaurant in Manhattan?
I love Clyde. It's not so much that I own the restaurant. I love him. He's just a spectacular man. And I happened to go to those games, and they were thrilling.
Yeah. Well, Clyde's is a fantastic place that Michael owns, and he's partners with Walt Frazier, of course, the legendary New York Knick. I love the Mets. I love the Knicks too, but Michael, I can still name every player on that 69 New York Mets team. I can't name one single Met these days. So whatever that means. What is your favorite New York City restaurant that you don't own?
It shifts. I like little joints. I mean, there's none in particular. New York is such a great restaurant town. It's hard to pick one. Every once in a while, I would tell you this. There are plenty of places that are built that I don't think will work, and they work fine. And there's places I think that should work and they don't work. So I'm always curious about the next new thing. I would say that Balthazar is just a great restaurant for the energy that they put into it, the recent ones. But there are so many. I love Da Umberto, which is an Italian restaurant on 17th Street, which has been around forever. And somehow, it just feels good today as it did when it opened 30 years ago. I guess I get the most excitement about going to a meal when every once in a while, it's like every 3 years, I guess, somebody who owns a table at Rayo's invites me to have dinner there. And, the food is just fine. Does
it live up to it, Michael? I've never been.
Oh, it's red sauce Italian. The food's good. Not great, but good. And just the whole atmosphere, all the wise guys and, politicians. And it's a lot of fun.
Well, I'll take my corner seat in 1982 at Peretti's on Columbus Avenue, a red sauce joint you own over Rails. How's that?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Last one of these. Assuming New York City is your favorite place, because I know you live there and lived there for many years. What's number two, if you have a number two favorite city?
In the United States?
Yeah.
It would be close between Los Angeles and New Orleans. Los Angeles, even though it's not a walking city, I like to walk. I can walk 10 miles a day in LA, just pick an area and walk around. And I love the food. I love what you did in Los Angeles, your restaurants over the years. And New Orleans, just because it's unlike any other city in the United States. It has a whole different feeling and great food, also a great walking city. Just those two.
I second that on both. And LA has really grown up over the 30 years that I've been there. I mean, it's on par in terms of trend leading food stuff as, with New York and San Francisco. When I first moved there, it was kind of a 2-restaurant town, Spago and anything else. But now it's really kind of grown up. So I would second that. I
honestly think LA is a trendsetter in food and New York follows. I think when I eat in restaurants in LA, I just, they're ahead of us. They're always a little bit ahead of us.
I wouldn't have said that, but I'm glad you did. Okay. I don't know that I disagree. Michael, there are a number of topics, as I mentioned, that I want to cover with you. There's so much in your career that I've admired, places of yours that I've loved, and just reading about you over the years and following your advice, and had the good fortune of being in business with you as well. But I really feel the need to kind of start with what we all experienced last year, and still experiencing this year. But the pandemic was devastating, of course, for restaurants. And then we saw racial justice protests. We had an election that was very, just a lot of stuff going on. I'm curious how you're feeling these days generally.
So, look, I think it's harder for people who are younger than I am. I'm 77 now. I was able to build a good life away from my business. I'm calm at 77. I'm not fearful of going broke personally. So that sort of enabled me to take this all in without getting too emotionally involved. And I am emotionally involved. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it. But our concern through this, and I know it sounds a little trite, but our concern for this has been how do we maintain the economic viability of our employees? And we've gone through 3 periods where things got tough. 9/11. At that time, my only restaurants were in Las Vegas, Washington, D.C., and New York. Well, New York was hit. Washington, D.C. was hit. I remember they had guided missiles outside our restaurant in Union Station. So we had a month where nobody was coming to our restaurants, literally. New York was basically closed down. We had 5 restaurants that were not accessible because the lower part of the city, if you remember, was closed down. Las Vegas, nobody could fly in. And Washington, where our restaurants were pretty much inaccessible. I didn't have to ask anybody in my organization to take a pay cut. Literally, the first person who did it was Walter Rauscher, who runs my event department. And he came in and he said, I don't want anybody to be fired. We're all prepared to take substantial pay cuts. What do you need us to do? And one by one, every manager came to us from their restaurants, because we sort of run this like a venture capital portfolio. You know, we establish the locations and the concepts, and we hire a general manager and a chef to run the restaurant. And after that, we're really sort of a knowledge source. If they need help or advice, we're there to give it to them. If they don't want to call us, I assume everything's all right until it's not. So all the managers, when we called them and said, what are you doing? They had already taken dramatic, pay cuts in 9/11. They did the same thing in 2008, 2009. This time around, which seemed more severe than either of those economically, we established a guideline that no matter how much money your salary was, we assumed the people that made the most were able to make their way through this, because we have good people who we think are fairly conservative in their lifestyles. And we made a rule that nobody could get more than $50,000 annually. Well, we had people making $500,000 running businesses for us that took a pay cut of $450,000. And that enabled us to buy the time to see where we were in terms of government help and where we were with what landlords were going to do for us. And we stayed that way for a long time, from, mid-March until June. Nobody in the company was getting more than $1,000 a week. And I guess my office, which has 60 some odd people in it right now, nobody makes more than 65% of their base salary. At the restaurants, if they're cash flowing positive, they're back up to 100% of the salary. But it gave us time. So in terms of the business, I was able to stay calm and make decisions not based upon, any pressure. Our banks were terrific. Most of our landlords were terrific. So that part was good. The bad part was dealing with the politics, the racial injustice. I just think these last 4 years, and, some of your listeners may not like this, but it's not because I'm a Democrat or Republican. It's just the way the Trump administration gutted everything and became a part of my thinking every single day. You just could not get away from it. And every day you thought you saw the worst, the next day it was worse. I have one TV set in my house. I'm not a big television person, but I have now during the pandemic and staying inside. I watched too many Bruce Willis movies on Netflix or Nicolas Cage. I'm trying to find things that they're not in. I thought at times when I was listening to the news, I was going to throw something at the TV. I was so angry at our situation, our country situation. And, every time I got that angry, I say, hey, it's my only TV, and I'm not going to go out and buy another one, But that's the way I felt. I am relieved that anger has lifted, and it's sort of lifted at the same time I have more hope for the business as, the vaccine gets distributed and the efficacy and the herd immunity. And I'm really looking forward this year in our business when we can get back to being cash flow positive, paying people more, hiring more people. That's I've always said, Brad, the only good thing I've done is, we hire people. We've created jobs. That's my pleasure to move the business forward and create more jobs. And we have wonderful people. It's great. It's a nice envelope.
You've done that exceptionally well. I want to stay on the subject, if you will, for a moment about the what we saw this year in terms of the issues around race, Michael. And do you feel that, obviously our country has a troubled history. And, in our business, in our industry, we deal with all kinds of folks. Do you think that what happened was necessary to expose the feelings that are out there, those that feel that the country is being taken away from them? Or do you think that was given unnecessary airtime? How do you feel about what we saw and where we're going from here?
I want to just preface that answer with something I learned when I was in my 30s. Barbara Smith was a dear friend. We went out for a long time. We had a customer at my first restaurant, the Museum Cafe, where I bought, which was my first restaurant, and it was the place at which I first met Barbara. She was a customer. And John Ford was a photographer, successful photographer, an African American. And Barbara was upset one day early in our relationship because she went to rent a new apartment, and she felt she was turned down because of the color of her skin. And I came in and I was upset, and I explained to John Ford why I was upset. And John said, "You're upset because Barbara didn't get the apartment." He said, "Why don't you try to put yourself in her shoes and think about how upset she is every day, because she didn't get the apartment. Your upsetness cannot be as deep or it just, you can't have the same feelings. And this is something she goes through every single day." And that was a great lesson for me. I think, it's very, very hard for people to put themselves, white America, to put themselves in, African American shoes and understand the anger. And I think the only way to understand the anger is to see the anger. And so I'm sort of happy that there's a Black Lives Matter. I'm happy that there was these demonstrations and these confrontations. I'm happy at the press coverage. I'm really sad about, the fact that, Black American families have to have these dialogues with their kids on how to feel safe or protect themselves. It's something that's always there, and we haven't gone far enough as a country, and I don't think the press coverage has been enough. It should be constant. And thank God everybody has a camera now that they walk around with on their phone, because I think that's going to help a lot. But there's so much further to go. I don't look at what the progress has been. I look at what the progress should be. and there has been progress, but it's not anywhere close. And I sort of hate those things where, somebody says, well, look at what's been accomplished. We shouldn't have this issue to start out with, but we do. It's reality. And, I just think the press coverage should be constant.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to come back to your involvement with Barbara, because I really, that was trailblazing. And the restaurant, of course, launched Barbara's restaurant career and made her a brand and a household name. But before I do, I'm curious, growing up, sitting around the Weinstein dinner table with your mom and dad, what kind of conversations took place then? Do you recall?
Yeah. Look, I had a middle class upbringing. the relationship between my mother and father was not always great. So a lot of time there was no dialogue at the dining room table. My mother was a bad cook. I had a golf career going, in high school, and that was fairly noteworthy in the area. So a lot of talk was around, that. But it was normal stuff, nothing that memorable.
No business conversations, no, here's what I want you to do with your future, son.
Oh, not at
really.
all. No.
So you initially went to law school, correct?
Right.
And then decided to get into investment banking rather than pursue law?
Yeah, I was offered a job through a friend of my father's. I went to law school, honestly, to stay out of the Vietnamese War. If you were going to graduate school in those years, you got a deferment. And then what happened, there was a lottery. They changed the draft system based upon a lottery, and it was based upon your birthday. So it was like they had 365 ping pong balls, and they pulled out a bunch of them and until the draft was filled, and it turned out I was never going to be called. So law school sort of went in the background, and I got a job in investment banking.
So from there, you and a partner, you go to a place called the Museum Cafe. And I remember the Museum Cafe. It was one of the first restaurants that my dad and I used to have regular meals at. And I was just blown away. It was for me, it was sophisticated. It just felt polished. There were hostesses there. But that was the place that caused you to really become infatuated with the restaurant industry, no? And it was the first place that you owned, of course. But tell me about what seduced you?
So my partner was a guy named Kerry Olson, who was a male model who I was friendly with. And another friend of ours, Jim McMullen, had opened up on the east side a small restaurant called Harper's that was jam-packed. And Kerry had a lot of downtime in his life. He was trying to get an acting career together, but he was a very successful male model. And he said, we could do that, And we found this place at 77th and Columbus Avenue that was 1,200 feet. We built the thing for $70,000. And because of a dearth of restaurants in the area, in the 70s, we opened November 7th, 1975. At that time, as you know, as your dad knew, if you wanted to go out for dinner, you didn't stay on the Upper West Side. You just go to Midtown, and if you wanted a steak, you probably had to wear a jacket and a tie. And there were few places that were relaxed, like P.J. Clark's or Harper's or J.G. Mellon's, on the Upper East Side. But there really wasn't anything very much on the Upper West Side at the time. And if you wanted Chinese food, you went to Chinatown. And if you wanted Italian food, you went to Little Italy. Mm-hmm. It was, sort of segmented. So we opened this restaurant, and what was great about it, we didn't have any money, so we left the front of the restaurant open to the street, which was the opposite of what everybody else was doing. But the street, you looked on the Museum of Natural History and those stand of trees up 77th Street between Columbus and Central Park West, which were breathtaking. And we didn't have money to close the ceiling up. You saw all the wiring and the air conditioning, and it became a thing. We served everything from a hamburger to beef Wellington, which was a dish that time, and anything from fish and chips to chadro. We used to sell, we had a blackboard menu, and, you could buy 1 lamb chop, 2 lamb chops, 3 lamb. You could buy everything by the piece. We were trying to make it as easy as possible for anybody to come in, and we were on, we stayed open till 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were full until 4 o'clock in the morning. It was extraordinary.
What did you follow, or whose advice, or what instinctively told you that hospitality was important? Because my memories of Museum Cafe really, the food, yes, the setting, yes, I loved sitting there watching people walk by. It was a great people watching space. But I always remember being treated well there. And it was the first restaurant that I went with my dad, and I just always felt like you walked in, you got acknowledged. Someone said thank you on the way out. Did you know that instinctively, Michael, that was going to be a key ingredient?
I think so. I always used to tell our waiters and waitresses, when a table pays, you say, thank you, your business is important to us. And they said it. And it was. I mean, you get a little successful and you do stupid things that become memorable. I mean, our food, if you remember, came with Chinese vegetables because we had a Chinese chef. The biggest day of the year was Chinese New Year's. We also, the Upper West Side was changing dramatically and with gentrification. And a lot of those apartments on 77th Street and 81st Street were being renovated. And when you renovate an apartment, you don't have a kitchen, and people would come in for breakfast. We didn't serve breakfast. We were serving our waiter meal, but people would come in and we didn't charge them. And, they just sat down because they were good customers and, regulars. And we said, come in for breakfast, And so we did a lot of things that were a lot of fun. And you do get, when you have something going where God has pointed down his finger and said, this is the one, you'll have a great run here. And we did. And you get a little cocky and you start to do stupid things that other restaurants are afraid to do. And I remember I had Candace Bergen and Chevy Chase sitting on the hood of a car with a checkercloth tablecloth, eating dinner because we didn't have room for them inside. So we served them on a car, and that became memorable. And Chris Reeves.
These days, that would go viral, as they say.
Chris Reeves was, playing Superman at the time, and I didn't know that the balloons for the Macy Days Parade when we opened the restaurant were blown up in front of us on Columbus Avenue and 77th Street. Had no idea. All of a sudden, we see these trucks come unloading these balloons. And somewhere I have a photograph of Chris Reeves sitting in the window with the Superman balloon being blown up, in front of him. And so there were a lot of things that start to happen that shouldn't happen. There was a girl named Merlan Taylor who was a big model in New York, and she had her. We had a piano for New Year's Eve one night, but it was delivered to us on December 30th. So we could have it for New Year's Eve on the 31st. And it was her birthday on the 30th. And everybody starts singing happy birthday. And all of a sudden a guy stands up in the back and comes over and grabs her, literally, hands on her head and gives her a big kiss on the lips. Looked like a crazy man. Sat down at the piano and started to clunk out a bad rendition of Happy Birthday. And then all of a sudden it was like Brahms played it and like Beethoven played it. And it was Victor Borge. And, things happen when you have a hot restaurant that is so memorable. So, it was a good start to a career.
Yeah, I have times like that too. We opened Memphis down the street from the Museum Cafe on between 75th and 74th and 75th. There was a night that Stevie Wonder and his wife were headed to Memphis. They called me from a limousine and said they were headed there. And I said, my dad's got something cool going on up at the Cellar. I'd really prefer you guys come there and I'll meet you up there. And they redirected the limo. I met them at the Cellar, and Stevie ended up getting on the stage and performing for 3 hours in front of a packed house just spontaneously. It was amazing. So on that note, Michael, I want to turn to kind of a funny story, but first, certainly want to acknowledge someone who, of course, we've talked about and I know was really, really dear and special to you, and that is Barbara Smith. And of course, she passed away a couple of years last year, and I want to offer condolences to her husband Dan Gadsby. But and so with all due respect, there's a bit of a funny story that Michael and I share, and I confirmed with him recently because I wanted to be able to share it with the audience. So my dad, as I've mentioned on this show before, owned a popular restaurant on the Upper West Side called The Cellar. Michael and he were, of course, in the same business. And Michael and Barbara Smith, who be B. Smith, as we all came to know her, had a relationship, a romantic relationship. And I want to hear about that because I know that America came and the restaurant that you opened downtown. And I remember the first time seeing Barbara on the floor in that beautiful room. And I was like, oh boy, restaurants are in trouble. If the combination is this room and that woman, that's going to be tough to beat. But at any rate, my dad dated Barbara for a period of time. Michael and she had dated prior. They broke up and my dad started to date Barbara. And her birthday rolled around and Michael, I guess, hadn't quite gotten over or decided that he wasn't finished with the relationship. And for Barbara's birthday, while she's dating my dad, decides to send a limousine to pick Barbara up. Michael, why don't you pick up the story from there so I don't get any of the facts wrong, because this is a great story.
Yeah, so I was very much in love with her. And so basically I somehow got a hold of a passport because I had gone up there to say hi when I was close to her apartment one day. I knew where she kept her passport, and I grabbed it. And then I sent a limo for her on her birthday. And I said, I'm taking you out. And she said, oh, okay. And we went to the airport and she said, where are we going? I said, it's a surprise. And we went on an Air France plane. You know, she saw Air France. She said, I don't have my passport. How are you going to get me on the plane? And I said, I have your passport. And at that time, she was supposed to go out with your father the next day. And she excused herself, and there was only public phones at that time. And I sort of stood away, and she called your father and said, Michael's taking me to Paris. We had no clothing, no luggage or anything. And basically, we landed in Paris and stayed a couple of days in Paris and made our way down to the south of France, to Saint-Tropez, and had a wonderful time buying clothes along the way and washing the clothes we bought. And it was great. And it reestablished the relationship again. And Barbara was extraordinary. I mean, as a person, she loved people. She was very, very smart and very funny. I mean, just hilariously funny, the way she saw the world. And, but when you talk about America and Barbara on the floor, the way she handled people was great. So when we got back, at some point, I always knew she loved the restaurant business and hospitality. And this location became available in the worst part of the city at the time, which was 47th Street and 8th Avenue. I mean, it was
some write-ups refer to it as the theater district. It was really not quite the theater district.
Right. It was, prostitution, transvestites, drugs, and everything. And I said to Barbara, we can make a great restaurant here. And so we built something that was very modern because it was the antithesis of everything around. It stood out. I mean, Barbara was once interviewed by the New York Times, and she said that the person said, why here? And she said, Michael likes urban decay. And and it was true, because we have a chance to change the neighborhood. And I said to Barbara,
you've done that in several locations of yours around the city. I mean, you were known for picking kind of gentrifying, not quite yet there neighborhoods, making great deals with landlords. In fact, I think you were one of the first restaurateurs to beat up landlords and make them put in money for the build out, what we call tenant improvement dollars these days.
So at any rate, I said to Barbara, we'll build business one person at a time with you. Just do your thing. Go over the tables, make them happy. And then there was a guy named Tony Schwartz. His daughter, Michelle, worked for us. And I get a call from this guy one day. He introduced himself. He said, you really should come up and see me. I could help you with that restaurant. I said, in what way? He says, well, I'm an advertiser. I could bring people to the restaurant. Well, we never advertised in our lives for all our restaurants. And it was going fine. And I sort of said, well, thank you. Let me have your number and I'll call you when I can do it. And back
for the audience these days, there was no such thing as publicists for restaurants back then. Right?
Correct. And I get a call 2 weeks later. You haven't called me back. He said, please come up here. I can really help you. And, I go to Michelle, who's his daughter working for us. And I said, I don't want to be rude, but, I don't advertise. She said, you really should speak to my father. So I go to this townhouse on 56th Street. where he had a complete studio, broadcast studio. And Tony Schwartz was a guy who had done something like 56 political campaigns for the likes of Robert Kennedy, and he had reintroduced Chrysler to radio for Lee Iacocca. He taught a class at Harvard, but he never left his house. He had that disease where he was afraid to leave his house. And he said, Michael, he said, there is a radio station that only deals WQXR, where most people going to theater are listeners of WQXR. That makes up the bulk of their listenership. And he said, if you give me the right to advertise on QXR at drive time when people are coming back into New York, to go to theater, he said, I could fill up that restaurant. And he had a guy he worked with who was his announcer. And I said, why don't we put Barbara on the air? And he said, well, what does she know? And, and I said, if you want to hear a voice that is like a magnet that will get everybody to come in, put Barbara on the air. And we put Barbara on the air. And then we had 120 seats. After the first ad, the next day, we had 300 reservations. It was his knowledge of, he told me, do you ever see a mortgage ad in the newspaper? I said, I really don't notice them. He pulled out a newspaper. There were 20 of them in the New York Times. He said, that's because you're not interested. He said, you have to advertise where you're, to people who are interested. And theater goers listen to WQXR. So that made the restaurant grow faster. And the great thing about that restaurant, I was always told Barbara, here was this very cool bar filled with the most stylish, best-looking African Americans in the world. I mean, in the world. Aman would be there, or whoever was there. But the greatest looking people. And in the dining room with these old 55-year-old Jewish women going to the theater,
I want to ask you about the racial.
Yeah, go ahead.
The racial dynamic. My dad's place, the Cellar, our clientele, although we were in a very multi-ethnic neighborhood, 95th Street and Columbus Avenue, our clientele happened to be 98% Black for whatever reason. And when I got involved in opening Memphis on 75th Street, some 20 blocks away, I was concerned in 1983 about how my clientele or our clientele who would follow me downtown would mix with the Columbus Avenue crowd that, I knew patronized restaurants down there, which meant a mostly white crowd. It ended up being fine. I'm curious, did any of that cross your mind? I know you were in love with Barbara. She was a beautiful woman, but you're also a very savvy businessman. Did you think about the whether or not the races would mix? Would it be a comfortable environment? Was there ever a moment where you thought, maybe this is going to be a little risky?
Never thought about it. And there was no, from my point of view, I had a great looking restaurant with a great partner, and that's all I needed. I really didn't think about it. I was delighted with who came. And, the only time I ever got mad, I'm trying to remember who was the reviewer for the New York Times. He wrote a review of...
Was it Brian Miller?
It was Brian Miller, right. He wrote a review. I wrote a letter to the Times. It was a disgraceful review. It was just a racist review. That's the only time, I ever got upset and thought about, who comes to restaurants and how other people would feel about it. To me, it was natural. I mean, I was delighted at the mix that she was. Barbara, everybody loved Barbara. There was, I never met a person, who didn't go, wow, she's spectacular. And I knew I had that when we opened the restaurant together. I mean, we were partners. I knew I had it, and it never occurred to me that it wouldn't be successful.
Michael, as an African American operator, restaurateur myself, I've more recently raised the issue of the lack of Black food journalists and how that has been to the detriment of African-American operators, chefs, the cuisine, the history, the story, what have you. It's interesting to me that you would have observed that the review from Brian Miller and interpreted it as racist back in the 80s. But that was your take on it. What do you remember, without the specifics, but do you remember what it was about the review that still makes you feel that way?
The only thing I recall was he talked about the crowd and the way they dressed, and it was like, this is unusual to have a successful Black-owned restaurant, and why should it be unusual? And why are you mentioning the crowd in such detail, and it wasn't mentioned as these are just people. It was sort of taking a biased view, and it just didn't read right to me. I wish I remembered it more, but
I appreciate that. So B. Smith's becomes this huge success. Barbara is working the room as you thought she would. What you had in mind works tremendously well. I mean, I remember driving up 8th Avenue and glancing over at because the restaurant, the bar ran along 8th Avenue for almost, right. It looked like almost a whole block. I think it might have been half a block. But I just recall I would see the bar jammed packed with folks. And I just knew that the restaurant was doing great. And, the competitive nature in our business, it caused me to worry about my dad's place, the seller whose clientele, who we relied on, a lot of those same folks. And there was this emergence of, I guess better mousetraps as sometimes it's referred to. I know Michael Vann worked for you for a while as a GM, and then Michael went on to open the Shark Bar. And, there wasn't quite a proliferation, but there were certainly some new places coming on. Alberta had Jezebel on 45th and 9th. Did you, with what Barbara became as a household name, Michael, did you see that coming? Did you think that she would become, I know she didn't like to be referred to as the Black Martha Stewart, but that's kind of how a lot of folks know her. Did you see that coming?
Look, I did not have a good relationship with Dan, her husband, but Dan had worked for King Productions and apparently had something to do with Oprah's success in terms of syndicating her. So I think Dan really took over at some point in managing Barbara's career. I actually had conversations, and I told Dan at the time about opening a Barbara Smith casino in Las Vegas. There was a property for sale, a rundown casino that I thought it would be worth having Barbara as a partner and doing a casino based around her. She was so dynamic that in any professional hands who understood syndication and understood branding, there was no limit to what could have been accomplished with her, and she sort of proved that, right? Her style show was great. The way, and all she had to do was smile. I mean, she radiated. And I think Dan did a good job in terms of getting her out there. But it was Barbara. Barbara could win over anybody.
But I do want to give kudos to you, Michael, because to launch an African-American woman, I mean, for what Barbara became, that you put your expertise, your reputation, and the financial support on the line to launch what became a phenomenal career. I just want to acknowledge you for that, and we're all a little bit better for having experienced B. Smith in our lives, and
thank you.
To a large part, we have you to thank for that. So thank you. I want to turn to Vegas, Michael, since you just brought that up. And, when you decided to launch in Las Vegas, I believe New York was your first venture there. I don't think that the food scene and the hotel scene had really started the renaissance. I think you were pretty much at the forefront of that. And if I'm not mistaken, taking over the food and beverage at New York. And I think I read somewhere where you were doing like 25,000 meals a day, but you ran all of their food and beverage. I think that was kind of setting a precedent. Was it at the time?
Yeah, it was unusual for a hotel, first of all, to be bring in an outsider to run, 85% of their food and beverage, which is what we have. It was also unusual for that operation to stay non-union, which we have been able to do. I have Gary Prim, the guy who's the developer of New York, to thank for that. He kept coming to New York to try to find restaurateurs somehow through Warner Leroy, who owned Tavern on the Green and Maxwell Plum. He went to Warner to try to make a deal to put Tavern on the Green in the middle of New York. And Warner said, well, look, I'll do a deal with you for the trade name. He said, but I can't run it. But there's a guy, Michael Weinstein, who could do it. Let me introduce you to him. And so what happened is Prim and I met one day. It was a nice spring day in New York. He never saw any of my restaurants. We just walked for 4 hours talking about it, and he invited me out to Vegas. It's one of those things. Let me send the plane for you. I said, I ain't going on a private plane. There are plenty of commercial planes. And so we went out and I saw the plans, and he said, can you find me a steakhouse? And I called everybody, and nobody really understood it. Finally, I called Jerry Brody, who owned Gallagher's, and I said, Jerry, you got to do this. Jerry was a friend, and Jerry said, I'll do it. And then Jerry, about a couple of months after, speaking to Prim, said, Weinstein's a better operator than I am. Why don't you let me give him the trade name, and he'll operate it. And then, of course, Prim could not make a deal with Warner that was a good deal for Prim. So he decided to put America in the middle of the casino. And then all of a sudden we had the steakhouse, we had America, and then he kept asking me, can I do the food court? Can I do this? And we wound up doing everything, banquets, employee dining room service. We didn't know what we were doing. Jonathan Waxman was my executive chef at the time, and he laid out the kitchen. I always tell the story, and he had great people that he brought in. But I tell the story, we bought $4.5 million worth of kitchen equipment. And I was so frightened, I said to the guys that were selling us the equipment, look, you got to let me give you back what we don't use. Because I don't know we're going to use all this stuff. Jonathan's laying it out. Can't be a 20% restocking charge. Could be a 5%, but you got to let me send it back to you. I can't afford this. And when all was said and done, out of $4.5 million, we returned $27,000 worth of stuff. Jonathan got it exactly right.
Wow.
The first night we did $270,000 in business the day they opened up the hotel, and we got it right. Paul Gordon was my general manager. He had been with me for 25 years at that point, still with me. It was just a terrific effort on everybody's behalf.
Well, I want to give you some additional props here, Michael, because you are known in the industry as, really one of the pioneers. And one of the things that I think anybody who's been in our industry can appreciate, you were way ahead of the curve on offering healthcare to employees. And back in I believe in the 80s, late 80s, you started offering healthcare to any of your employees that worked a minimum of 3 shifts. You also would offer to actors who would get an acting job, a guaranteed job upon return. And then, and as we know, of course, our industry is filled with creative. So I'm sure that went over quite well. But one of the things that just really caught me when Ernie's was a huge restaurant that Michael opened on the Upper West Side. I think it was the biggest restaurant to date at the time. I think you seated 300 people, something close to that at Ernie's?
325.
325. At some point, fortunately, I don't believe anyone was in the building at the time, but the building collapsed. And it took about 8 months to rebuild Ernie's. Michael kept everyone on payroll. throughout the entire 8-month period until Ernie's was rebuilt. And it's those kinds of things, Michael, that, you know, people like me who work with people in our industry, it's just unheard of. And I know as an independent operator and all the conversation around healthcare these days, and for an independent, it's very hard, if not impossible, to provide healthcare. Just some of these things I think have really endeared you to the industry that I know you love.
Well, thank you. Where did you read all of this stuff?
I did a little research. So, Michael, you went on to do some stuff at the Venetian Hotel and teamed myself up with David Rabin and Will Regan in New York, who at the time had Lotus. This was 1999. I had the Sunset Room in Los Angeles, and we opened a place called VBar on the casino level at the Venetian, which ran for about 15 years. How did the Venetian relationship come about?
So Lou Silvestri, who was the leasing guy for New York, moved over to the Venetian. And he called me up, and I had just bought Lutece. And he called me up, and he said, you know, there's opportunities here. Are you interested? I said, well, you know, I don't want to just do one restaurant. Are there more than one opportunity? And it turned out that there were several, and they were very excited about getting Lutece. That was a big name for them. We also built something called Tsunami, which was on the mall floor, which the second floor of above the casino. We had 4 of the fast food court positions. And then what happened is they had what was called the Rialto bar that was doing terrible. It was a piano bar. And I went to Rob Goldstein. I said, this is awful. And you know, it was nice. Rob was acting as the CEO, even though Sheldon Addison was officially the CEO. And we had a nice relationship. And I said, you know, that place is just awful. And you really got to go to New York and see some of these cool bars. And I think they would do well here. And he did a little research. He said, I think you're right. Who should I get? I said, well, you should get me. He said, what do you know about, you know, cool bars? I said, nothing, but I have the right guys. And that's how you, Will, and David got involved. And we had a great run.
It was fantastic, man. Yeah, it really was. Had a blast there.
Sheldon sort of got mad at me when they did the second phase of the mall. He had leased my space, Tsunami, thinking he could move me to Barney's, and I didn't want to be moved. And so he got mad at me and basically bought me out of Tsunami at a fair price. And he just passed away, but he said it was a fair price, you know. And Goldstein thought I could have gotten more, but, you know, I just wanted a fair price. So they bought me out of that and Lutece and out of the fast food court. And we still had a little while to run on the VBar at that point, but I knew they were never going to renew the lease. Sheldon didn't want me around. So that's why it ended. But it was a great run. I have you to thank.
Well, I have you to thank. Thank you. And David and Will, it was a great partnership. So, Michael, I knew this was going to just go too fast, but as we wind down, some folks are predicting a roaring 20s type of return to, you know, our industry, where bars and restaurants are going to jam pack as people are ready to get out and socialize. Others are saying not so fast. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that predicts office space is never going to return to what it was. What's your take?
So I think if you have the right brand, and not meaning multiples of, you know, a named restaurant, but like Bryant Park is a brand. Sequoia in Washington, D.C. is a brand. What we're seeing in the South, where people are not paying as much attention to guidelines, CDC guidelines, our Florida restaurants are doing really well. Our Alabama restaurants are doing well. I think people want to socialize. They're not going to be able to go to clubs. I think they're going to avoid bars until there's herd immunity. Older people, young people, I think are out there already. I'm sort of thinking it's going to be okay. What worries me more than anything else is the disruption, deliveries. It's been a huge disruption. Those are restaurant seats essentially being replaced by dining room seats in your house. I know that, I became a homebody during this period of time, and I've learned, to have my kids come over. They both have their own apartments. We sit around and we cook something, and it's delightful. I used to be out of force of habit in a different restaurant every single night, whether they're my own or others. I like that restaurant scene. I know I'll return to it, but I really wonder how many people won't return as frequently, because they've learned to enjoy family meals at home again. But I think overall it'll be good. I think it'll be good, and I think it'll happen pretty quickly. And I think office buildings will be occupied again. There's something about the creativity of people being together and the adhocracy of being able to walk into somebody's office and getting an answer. Right now I have 60 people all working from home. And if I want an answer, it's not like walking 20 feet. All of a sudden I got to make a phone call, hope that they're there, leave a message, hope that they call back. It makes it working at home is fine. We've learned to do it, but it loses some immediacy and therefore creativity. And people don't like to wait for answers. We have a rule in our office, and I've always been great about this. Every phone call has to be returned every day. I don't care if it's 11 o'clock at night. You have to return a phone call. You don't want people carrying over their anxiousness to the next morning. Get people the answers. And with everybody working at home, we're not able to do that as well as we used to. So I think offices come back for that reason.
Well, Michael, it's really been informative and a pleasure. And you truly are one of the leaders in our industry. And so many of us look up to you and admire you for not just your business success, Michael, but just the kind of person that you are, the man that you are. I mean, you're just a tremendous example of how to operate successfully and also do good. Thank you so much, Michael, for being a guest today on Corner Table. All the best to you.
Thank you. I'm honored. Take care.
So everybody, it's the time of the show that I really look forward to every Corner Table Talk, and that's a little time with my dear friend, Ambassador Shabazz. What's going on?
Oh, God, lots is going on, as always. I mean, it's just picking and choosing which we want to talk about today. And I think what I'm going to explore is the fact that in the last 2 weeks, I've been inundated with customizing designer travel bubbles, if I could use that terminology. I'm going to use the terminology because in the last year and a half, it's kind of become what we understand when people are moving around, like the NBA, WNBA. And generally, when I take people on the road, we kind of have that anyway. It just doesn't have the restrictions we have to be mindful of. Only now people are kind of ready. I think we've lived the last couple of weeks, couple of months, feeling a little bit more safe about how we do that. Also, locations are ready for us to do that. So this means we have 2 coming up in August, 1 in October, 1 in November, 1 in December already. 20 people per. Generally, you have to be 10 in a space. So it's also accommodating that. But in my context, I can get to figure out what people really want to experience. So I can assure that the travel experience is full without the risks. And so they range from everything like writers' retreats, people wanting to shut down in a sabbatical and focus on what they need to draft. We have the one we did a couple of years ago, Wisdom, Wellness, and Work, is kind of like the essentials of life balance. People are really ready to figure out that again and get on that page. We have a couple of study abroads. They want to use the month of September to just do a 3-4 week immersion for their academic studies and also getting to know culture and that. So I've been working on that the last couple of weeks, and I'm excited because it means I'm re-engaged the way I like.
One of the things that comes up for me when I'm starting to envision some of the people that you're able to coalesce around these excursions. I mean, you probably handle 50, 60, 70 phone calls on a busy day. I mean, I've been around you. I know what your phone sounds like, and it's kind of crazy. And the folks that you attract, though, are people from Susan Taylor to a gentleman who I'd never heard of from Baltimore doing some beautiful things in the community. Yeah. And the conversations that emerge at night around a simple dinner of rice and peas and fish, and those simple arrangements and opportunities for people to just connect with one another is something that I think is just really just so in your wheelhouse and your special skill set. Can you just talk about how the mix of people, how do you even cultivate that?
Well, it is invitational, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why there's no website that advertises. It's not just a come one, come all. I could refer people to different places, and I do that a lot. But when I'm selecting people, it's people I know who need the experience, who yearn for it, who wouldn't pause to do it, but should, and who may need to hear their echo in another person that they're sharing a moment with, whom they would never have thought was their twin. So I hear that a lot. You know, sometimes people are paying the price for a double, but they don't have a companion they're traveling with. And I'm entrusted to give them a roommate. And it's, you know, adults traveling, right? So, and they'll always come out and say, how did you know we would know each other like that? So I think it's listening. It's just one of the things early on in my life, being surrounded by cultures, people coming from parents and grandparents who really assessed and trusted people as they were. And so you're able to dive in. I remember one time we had a group, the age range was 25 to 55. And someone thought that that was too rangeful. But you want to say, no, their hearts and natures were all the same. How they were wired was very much the same. Their humor was very much the same. Their sense of social impact. And all of them happened to have been reigning in their respective lives, but needed privacy.
You know, I'm going to self-relate here for a second because, you know, in a restaurant, that's what I try to do. I try to curate an environment that is pleasing, you know, musically, lighting wise, the food. And what I've seen you do is just because of your energy and your spirit, when people are in your presence and their phones are left in their rooms and we're sitting around a fire and there's stars out in the sky. I mean, just things that come out of those kinds of interactions and conversations, and in some cases are life-changing, but definitely memorable.
Well, you know, most people move fast. Americans move fast. That's why the delegations are 9 days, one full week, bookended by 2 weekends. Because early on, people would hit the ground and they would bring Brooklyn with them. They would bring Chicago with them, and they would expect where they were going. And it didn't respect the spaces we were in. So we started to change it, move it a certain way. And we start in the city so people can kind of like touch concrete to concrete. And then we just move it out gradually. And I always find by the fourth day, people have an accent, you know, because they're moving to the music or the sounds. They're less inhibited. They're not trying to deal with the ceiling being too high. They suddenly realize the sky's the limit. That for me is the joy of being able to curate these things.
Well, that's what we're trying to get across with how we move. And Ambassador, there is no one that I can think of that is a better spiritual tour guide than you. So thank you once again for these brilliant insights, and sign me up for everything. I'm there with you. And we'll be providing this information for our subscribers. We hope you all subscribe. And when you go to our Instagram, you'll see, or any of our socials, you'll see places where all of the websites and social contacts for some of the things that we're talking about, you'll be able to find them there. So, Ambassador, thanks again.
Thank you.
Corner Table Talk is hosted by Brad Johnson, produced by Brad and Linda Ailes Johnson, coordinating producer Lauren Turner, theme music Life Goes On by Bryce Vine, executive producers Omar Thompson, Andrew Kalb, and Ken Johnson. Find the Corner Table Talk podcast wherever you get your podcast. Follow, subscribe, rate, and leave a comment. Corner Table Talk is a Say It Loud Network production.